the end of the moral interpretation of the world, which no longer has any sanction after it has tried to escape into some beyond, leads to nihilism. All lacks meaning. And then he says, the untenability of one interpretation of the world, upon which a tremendous amount of energy has been lavished, awakens the suspicion that all interpretations of the world are false. So it's a brilliant observation, because his point is, I've seen this in fundamentalist Christians, for example, who I've taught in the past, because I have a very biological view of things. And these people, I met more of them when I was in the United States, they were more intelligent than they were wise, meaning the constraints within which their intellect was forced to operate, which would be the Christian fundamentalist constraints, were not sophisticated enough to encapsulate their intellect. They were too smart for their own theories. So they come to university and be exposed to ideas that were outside the scope, say, of Christian fundamentalism, would just blow their fundamentalist presuppositions into bits. And so then, of course, they fall into nothing. But Nietzsche says it's even worse than that. It's not only that you fall into nothing, it's that once one of your systems of belief has been destroyed, you also learn that systems of beliefs themselves are unreliable. And so you can't just move easily from one to another, because it's like, well, you're in a boat and it's sunk, and now you know that if you jump to the next boat, that boat could also sink. So it's not only that your boat has sunk, it's now you know that all boats can sink. And so that's part of the position of the modern person, as far as Nietzsche was concerned, is that every one of us knows, at least in principle, that all the boats that we want to jump into could potentially sink. And so Nietzsche saw nihilism as the inevitable consequence, the inevitable rational consequence of that realization. Now, I told you guys before, Nietzsche was a very, very influential person. He influenced Heidegger, and Heidegger influenced Binswanger and Boss. But Nietzsche also influenced Jung as much as Freud did. And Jung spent his whole career trying to solve the question that Nietzsche posed. One of the questions was, because we must experience nihilism before we can find out what value these values really had. So, the collapse of a belief system makes all the values within it no longer tenable. That's the meaning of Nietzsche's statement that God is dead. He said if you take the central axiom out of a system of belief, you can't hold on to all the things that were derived from that axiom. So here an example is this. So for example, in modern Western law, there's a presupposition, and the presupposition is that in some weird sense, everyone is equal before the law. And that's predicated on the idea that even applies to someone who's a murderer. If you're a murderer and it's known, you have to be treated with respect. You have to be treated with respect by the legal system. And that's a very, very strange, it's a miracle that something like that ever emerged, because it's so unlikely. So then you might ask, well, what is the idea that everyone has worth before the law grounded in? Where does that idea come from? It comes from the idea of natural rights, that we have natural rights. And then you might ask, well, where do the idea of natural rights come from? Well, and then you're starting to move beyond the realm of rational philosophy, because natural rights, the idea of natural rights has been an idea that's been emerging for thousands and thousands of years. It's grounded in Christianity, at least it's grounded in Christianity to the degree that one of the things that distinguishes Christianity is the idea that there's a universal faith, and that everyone, whether they're in that faith or not, has intrinsic value. And so natural rights are grounded in the idea of the intrinsic value of the soul. And then that's grounded in the idea that consciousness itself participates in creation, and say that's an idea that's embedded in Genesis and also in most creation stories. So when you get rid of the religious underpinnings, which ground the entire system in a kind of dreamlike mythology, when you get rid of that, there's no reason that what's left over rationally can survive. And you can see that if you look at what happened in the 20th century, because there were at least two major challenges to to the civilizations that evolved, and they weren't only Christian or Jewish civilizations, the same thing happened in China. There was a replacement of these evolved moral systems that emerged over a tremendous amount of time that no one rationally created. Once people started to criticize them and to destroy the axioms on which they were built and move them aside, then there was a gaping hole left. And the hole was filled, well, it was filled most particularly either by Nazism, which, you know, spread like mad throughout Central Europe, or by communism, which still possesses China. So, you know, even though China came from a historical culture that was substantially different from, say, that of Western Europe, once rationality emerged to the point where it could be used as a critical force, which happened in Europe, that spread like mad, and it undermined the societies of China, just like it undermined the societies of the West. I mean, Russia, you can read this if you read Tolstoy, for example. In Tolstoy's Confessions, Russia was really the last country that underwent the transformations that were associated with the Enlightenment. So when Tolstoy was a young person in the late 19th century, he said he could literally remember when the announcement spread through his school that God was dead. Now, the Western Europeans had been working on that idea for a couple of hundred years, you know, with the dawn of scientific thinking. But the Russians were very backwards in some sense, and they were never affected by the conflict between rationality and religion until it happened all at once. And it happened all at once at the end of the 19th century. And the consequence of that, it's complicated, but the consequence of that was that the monarchy exploded, and then the consequence of that was that the Russians were left with nothing. And the consequence of that was the Bolshevik Revolution. And then that was what started the entire Soviet nightmare. You see very frequently that when a society loses its grounding, say in its historical truths, that it turns to something as an alternative. You see the same thing happened in Quebec, because Quebec didn't undergo the modern transformation until the late 1950s. It was probably the last European society to go through the Enlightenment Revolution, because the Catholic Church was an incredibly dominant force in Catholic Quebec until the late 1950s. I mean, the average family size during that time must have been in the neighborhood of 10 children. And then all of a sudden, in the late 1950s, the Quebecers just lost their Catholicism. It was just gone. And now, for example, the Quebecois have the lowest marriage rate in the Western world, and one of the lowest reproduction rates as well. And there was a Gallup poll that was conducted. I heard about this must be 10 years ago now. I don't know if this information has ever been made public, but there was a Gallup poll that indicated that if you were a Catholic who had lost your faith, so you left the church, you were 10 times more likely to be a separatist. So you can see the consequence of it is that if one belief system disappears, well, nihilism is one possibility. But another possibility is that you just adopt the next thing that's close that gives you structure. And nationalism, of course, is one of those things.